in this episode of the Critical Oxygen Podcast.
You're trying to define a physiological benchmark or some reference point which allows you to distinguish zone 1, 2, and 3. And I actually, I would say maybe it's not that important which boundary you use. It's more the amount of data you're gathering.
Hey everyone, Phil Batterson here. I just wanted to interrupt the program really quick to apologize for the poor audio quality from my end. For some reason, the recording technology that I use just wasn't recording the best audio today. I had a really great conversation with Dr. Sperlich, and I hope that doesn't detract from all of the great content that is within this episode. Him and I talk about things like training intensity distributions, why you would want to use polarized training versus pyramidal training, throughout different portions of the season, what wearables to use, other things like that. And he's one of the leading researchers on this sort of stuff. So, like I said, I just wanted to issue an apology in advance for everybody. I really think the content is really good. His audio sounds really, really good. So unfortunately, my audio does not. So I apologize for that, but I hope you guys enjoy. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Critical Oxygen Podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your athletic potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson, and today we're joined by Dr. Billy Sperlich, who is a researcher and professor in training science and exercise physiology with more than 20 years of experience in teaching and research. He's interested in taking an integrative perspective on mechanisms explaining the modulation of performance and health in different populations, and in doing so, he is a firm believer in the use of wearable technology for understanding the various modulators of adaptation and free living conditions. Today, we're going to talk about training intensity distributions and the use of wearables in endurance sports. Dr. Billy Sperlich, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me here.
Yeah, I'm really excited because I published, or I didn't publish. I looked at one of your papers and reviewed one of your papers, and then somehow somebody tagged you in it. And, then we got to talking on Instagram, and, we set this up a while ago, but now we're finally able to talk about, kind of these training intensity distributions and other things like that. So I'm really excited.
Yeah, thank you to the guy who got us hooked up.
Yeah, no, I know. And for those of you out there, if you do know, like the first author of papers that I review or do anything like that, tag them or say, hey, it'd be awesome to get, this person on the podcast, and then I'll reach out to them. And if they have time, we'll make it work to the best of our ability. So with that, Dr. Sperlich, if you wouldn't mind just giving people a little bit of an introduction to your background, like what got you interested in, exercise physiology, those sort of things, because it's always interesting to hear somebody's origin story, as it comes to academia,
absolutely.
in a sense.
Yeah. Well, I used to be a track and field guy. I was running, throwing, jumping, and after a while, I had some injuries, and I don't know really why, but my emphasis really was the last discipline, in decathlon, which is the 1500 meters.
Mm-hmm.
So one day my coach said, hey, listen, I think those 9 other disciplines, maybe you're not the best in those. Let's try the last one. And
right.
I was a middle distance runner for some time. And I also had some knee issues, some Achilles issues. And then it's quite, if you're in endurance, jumping to triathlon isn't too far.
Mm-hmm.
And in the 90s, actually, triathlon was kind of like a baby discipline. The Hawaii Ironman was popping up, and all these sensational performances, in the heat, and all these guys battling and running, and Mark Allen running, and I was fascinated by the sport. The thing was, for me, a little bit, I started swimming a little bit too late, maybe at the age of 16, 17, which isn't probably the very best time to start swimming. Drafting at that time was it was an issue, but was not a rule, neither for the Olympic distance nor for the long distance Ironman. So Yeah, I really enjoyed triathlon. The thing with triathlon then was at the time, actually, there weren't any, at least not in Germany, I wasn't aware of any really highly educated triathlon coaches, really from the background triathlon. Usually they came from running, swimming, or
Mm-hmm.
cycling. So you had all these very specialized, nerdy coaches. And with triathlon, you have three disciplines. And if you maybe take strength training into that equation, maybe you have four disciplines. And getting four disciplines time aligned or at least streamlined in a certain way, that actually was my passion in physiology or exercise physiology. How can I combine? How can I strategically combine swimming, cycling, and running, and plus strength training, and getting everything a little bit aligned? So yeah, that was the starting, and then of course by doing so, you think of there's some rumors this guy's eating this type of carbs and that amount of um, carbs or other supplements, and then you start wondering what's the background, what's the theory behind it. When you're 20, 21, you actually you don't care, you just do whatever the champion does, more or
Mm-hmm.
less. And I'd say that's definitely, I would say, a rule I wouldn't follow anymore, or I wouldn't do if I'd come back one day. And yeah, but then nutrition, heat. Had or I tried to qualify for Hawaii Ironman in Nice in France in the south, and it was a really 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 hot day, and I got hit by the heat. And then thermoregulation all of a sudden was a topic for me. And then I was a little bit involved in the preparation of the German track and field team for Beijing and London Olympics. Then high altitude was a topic, and um, all these, I'd say, very special fields which are important for endurance athletes always crossed my professional doing. And I've been interested in all of these areas so far. And of course, when you invest a lot of time in triathlon, let's say at least 20, maybe 25 hours per week, which is quite typical, then after a while, thinking of intensity is, I'd say, one key component.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe a little bit of a background from the German training science tradition. When I grew up, high volume, or let's say the more higher the volume, the better, was the strategy to go for.
Mm-hmm.
There are actually some influential German textbooks, which the translation is more or less, if you engage in high intensity exercise with a high lactate concentration, your mitochondria will, or the mitochondria content will decrease, or your mitochondria will get destroyed. And that was a little bit the thing. I grew up high volume, low intensity exercise, low intensity
Mm-hmm.
exercise. And during my studies at the sport university in Cologne, I was a children's coach for swimming and track and field. And I realized quite early that high intensity intervals are the way to go, in
Mm-hmm.
at least in children, because children, if you look at a group, half of the group are, the low, lazy, type of athletes with basically no ground contact time at all. So they're really gluing on the track, and those are probably the ones more engaging in low intensity exercise. And then you have the really, the fast guys, the sprinters, the jumpers, and those actually, I think, profit more from high intensity interval training. And then So I saw the textbooks were not aligned to what I was doing and living as a coach.
Hmm.
But I still, this textbook sentence was still the thing. Hey, you cannot engage, you're destroying mitochondria. You cannot engage in high intensity interval training. This is a psychological distress, high intensity intervals. And I say, no, it isn't. The minute you have a good performance in your swim competition, that's psychologically, I think, the thing to do. As a child, you invest time and you want your revenue basically. So I was a little bit in a conflict. That was beginning 2000, I would say, and
Okay.
then a Canadian group came up, Gibala I
Hmm.
think, or actually a Norwegian group in 2005 or six on interval training, then Gibala in cycling. And I went back to my supervisor at that time and I told him, hey, listen, the evidence is out. We need to investigate high intensity interval training. And for me, as a coach at that time in children, swimming and track and field, I said, I desperately need to do studies in that area. And
Hmm.
that's how I got engaged in this, what might be the best solution in terms of endurance training. Of course, the studies at that time were limited, usually around maybe 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks of intervention.
Yep.
You modulate just a certain time of a child's or life basically, and but still, we could prove or show that high intensity interval training is quite, at least in that 10-week time frame, is no big deal. They fatigue, but they recover.
Hmm.
Improvements are the usual 5 to 8%, depending on how many sessions you do. So and then of course, in Germany at that time, we all of a sudden we were allowed to do high intensity intervals. So that was a little bit different to maybe the North American, Canadian, Scandinavian, maybe even, or British approaches. So what I think then happened was a little bit a harsh discussion on it was all about high intensity intervals,
Right.
maybe
The pendulum swung to the other side.
completely in the other direction. And now the last 10 years, I would say we're calibrating a little bit.
Hmm.
We're identifying or trying to identify best practice patterns in various different in different sports. So
Hmm.
yeah, that actually was a little bit my background. And these discussions with coaches, which or how much of high intensity intervals would you add to your normal training or to your low intensity interval training, yeah, has been on my agenda now the last 10 years. And then a nice colleague from Austria, Tom Stögel, he contacted me and he said, "Hey, let's do an experimental study." Or actually, he was already on the way doing the study, an experimental study on a little bit looking what are the differences between low intensity continuous exercise, threshold training, polarized training, and what we then called pyramidal at that time
Hmm.
patterns. And actually, the outcome from that study was that polarized trumped basically all the other
Hmm.
patterns, but always, and I think that's important for the listeners here, just within a time frame of, I think, as I remember, 9 weeks. So we had
Okay.
three times 3 weeks, and we looked at those. So 9 weeks of exercise, we could show that the polarized was the best pattern. So that was a more let's say, adding onto the terminology, Steven Seiler started, I would say, I think his first publication was in 2006 or 8. I don't remember completely
Okay.
anymore, but
Yeah. He's been
a
around.
long,
He's been
long,
around density distribution, game for a long time.
yeah,
Um, First, just to clarify some things. So, when you're looking in the literature, right, we're talking about training intensity distribution, and you kind of went over this, but could you, maybe give like a high level definition for people, and then
yeah.
going back to the paper that you and is it Tom, and how do you say his last name?
Stögel.
Stigl. Oh boy, yeah. I won't even. I
Stögel.
won't.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll let you. I'll let you pronounce it. But that paper where you guys were comparing, like the low intensity training to the, the polarized versus pyramidal, and
Yeah.
you compared all of those. Could you just give a quick definition of all of those, just for the listeners?
Yeah, maybe before I do that, I think we would need to maybe define a little bit intensity. So
Okay.
the thing was, or the thing still is, if you look at different sports, let's say cycling or running or rowing or swimming, all the federations, let's say also here in Germany or probably elsewhere, the same, they use different spectrum
Mm-hmm.
or of intensities. So I would say the 5 zone model and maybe the 7 zone model are probably in the practical area are the most widely used,
Mm-hmm.
let's say, zoning or clustering of intensities. The thing is now, how do you define a 5 zone, a 7 zone, or we in research we use the 3 zone because it's easier to compare studies.
Mm-hmm.
So many of them use peak heart rate or VO2 max as the 100%, and then they do percentage clustering. So zone 1 could be a very low VO2 max compared to the 100%.
Mm-hmm.
It could be heart rate based. We here in Germany, I still think are very, I maybe even say fanatic. We like to define the intensities based on blood lactate, which I have a
Mm-hmm.
lot of experience as well. I still like to do that because there is some information, but most
There's a
probably
lot
it's
of
not the
information.
absolutely, but most probably we could find the ups and downs, and there's been studies out, and actually the paper we're discussing today, we also, one of the reviewers, he was really good. He challenged us a little bit on what's the reliability on this zoning, and actually it's quite poor.
Mm-hmm.
So keep in mind, defining the zones is a little bit, let's say, a blurry thing to do.
Yep.
So it's not perfect, but still, for intensity, actually, we have some models. We have zone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or zone 1, 2, 3 in a 3 zone model. I think that's okay. What we do not have, not at all, at least not to my knowledge, we don't have models for the volume. So
Right.
you could define a zone 1 no matter in which type, and I wouldn't say you could do that forever, but for a very, very long time. But the question is, can we identify a model or any framework on telling us, okay, zone 1 for you is 2 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours. How long is it? We don't know. So okay, that's maybe a little bit a different story. And the training intensity distribution actually in the end is summing up basically the time you spent or the kilometers or usually it's the kilometers, but I would say mainly it's the time spent in zone 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5.
Mm-hmm.
And the main idea is if you know the quantification, how much percentage in which zone, then one goal is to identify something like what we would call dose response relationship. We as a coach or as a researcher, we'd like to know, okay, more zone 4 and 5, VO2 max going up 2 or 3% or 8%. So we try to find a little bit of dose response relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing coming maybe to the paper is, well, it wasn't a meta-analysis, but I would say a quite extensive, maybe more systematic review. The first issue I'd like to highlight is that the sports we were looking at, we call them endurance sport, but running definitely is different to rowing, is different to cycling, is different to swimming, is different to ice speed skating, to biathlon. They all differ extensively,
Mm-hmm.
and especially, I would say, running compared to all the others. Running itself has a quite high eccentric component, and you have a lot of steps involving eccentric forces, which you basically do not have in cycling more or less at all,
Mm-hmm.
I would say, or in swimming, meaning that the volumes in those sports like cycling, cross country skiing, swimming will be, I would say, at least double the amount compared to running, just because you need a lot of recovery time from those from the eccentric exercises. So
Mm-hmm.
my issue I had when I started that review almost two years ago was how can we, or is there a fair comparison, especially running, to all the other sports? And then another issue is rowing and cross country skiing involve basically all your muscles.
Mm-hmm.
Cycling, maybe not as much. So then the question is, how do you define a training intensity distribution on a whole body exercise versus a lower body exercise? The next issue was sports like, let's say, ice speed skating, for example. The athletes there, they not only or mainly engage, I would say, in maybe inline skating or similar to inline skating, which we would call maybe a semi-specific
Mm-hmm.
exercise. But then you also have non-specific like cycling. So they do a lot of cycling in ice speed skating. And then the question pops up, how do you combine these different types of exercises? And that's if I'm honest, it's a nightmare. It's not possible. Then the next thing, and I think that's a really, really big issue, and nobody so far has been tackling that issue at all.
Well, I
Sport,
at least from my perspective, I've seen Training Peaks try to do something along those lines where they
yeah,
have, training impulse or,
yeah,
something where it's like they're taking into account your zones as it relates to both your mechanical,
I mean,
sort
yeah,
of output, which would be your speed and your power, or your internal uh,
yeah,
output, which is your heart rate or lactate values or SMO2 or whatever you want to actually do. But again, it's still it's I would say you hit it right on the head, right? With running, is that running you make so much more damage for a certain volume of running compared to cycling, that how do you actually compare that, right? Because your heart
absolutely,
rate may not be super high, but the eccentric loading that you have might require 2 times the amount of recovery. That's just a hypothetical number, but it's a lot more than cycling. And that's what I've been finding with my cycling training is I can go and do something. We'll talk about polarized training in just a little bit, but I can do something that's a little higher than zone 2, hold it for an hour, hour and a half, come back the next day and do a VO2 max workout and still hit super high numbers. Whereas running,
yeah.
if I did
No,
something
no
that was
way.
in like that zone 3, no way I'd be able to come back and do a VO2 max workout the next day. I'd potentially get injured, I'd feel terrible, other things like that. So yeah, it's a really interesting conundrum that you're bringing up, and not something that I think a lot of people
Yeah, and
appreciate.
plus, I think there's one, I think a very, very important information lacking is that sports like swimming, cycling, of course, but I know from cross country skiing, those athletes have a lot of time in the gym,
Mm,
and it depends a little bit on how you do your strength workout, but that leads to a quite severe metabolic disturbance as well, depending on what you do. And so far, strength training for some sports like canoeing and kayaking, I just would hypothesize, but at least from the German data I know, it's almost 50-50. They have a lot of strength training. So
hmm
how can we how can we, let's say, analyze that? Because it is a certain type of maybe zone 5 exercise after a while, depending on how long you do it, but it's not integrated in any dose response models so far. So that's something I really have a bad stomach feeling, to be
hmm
honest, when we probably discuss the data, what, what what we published, because I think it's very, very important. Plus, you have other issues like in swimming, for example. If you're in butterfly, I would say zone 1 exercise in a specialized athlete in butterfly just basically doesn't exist. Or I
Right.
couldn't. If I do a butterfly, I'd probably be in zone 3. Even if I wanted to target zone 1, it's just basically impossible.
hmm
So there are many, many issues around that. And for the listeners, I really keep that in mind. The sports differ, and a finding in cycling or a finding in running, I don't, please do not translate that information to the sports you're into, and don't use it maybe as a template or as a justification maybe for a polarized or non-polarized um, um, distribution, because the sports differ enormously.
I think that is a phenomenal point, because what I see a lot of people do is they take a research paper and they say, oh, these elite level athletes are doing the majority polarized training, and then they just say, I need to do polarized training, without ever looking at the fact that, like, elite level marathoners have been training for 20, 30 years potentially, and accumulating hundreds, if not like hundreds of miles a week. And then runners take that and they're like, oh, I need to do polarized training as well. It's like, well, if you're only running 3 days a week, then yes, you probably need to do some easy days. You need to do like a hard day here or there. But trying to do polarized training is only going to fit you specifically if you have enough time in order to be able to actually make it polarized, right?
Yeah,
And we haven't even defined, polarized training and pyramidal
yeah,
training and stuff like that. Yeah, we've gotten to the point. Okay, so identifying, like the different intensities, that's important. We first, that's kind of what we need to do. We need to say, okay, we need to do some delineation between lower intensity work, whether that's a 3-zone model or a 5-zone model, moderate intensity work, and then high intensity work. That's really what we're trying to do. And the way that I talk about it, and why I think researchers use a 3-zone model, is because you can take somebody into the lab, you can do a step test, and you can identify ventilatory thresholds 1 and 2. You can identify lactate thresholds 1 and 2, Near's break point, well, really whatever thresholds you want to identify.
exactly.
And then you can get an idea where those delineation points are happening. And you said it perfectly, and this is something that I've been trying to push lately, is people doing physiology testing repeatedly over time, because those zones are going to change, and they're going to change based on if you're fatigued, they're going to change based on hydration status, they're going to
Day
change
by
based on
day.
all these different things. So the more historical data we get, the better off we're going to be able to estimate that those fluctuations or those differences and
Exactly.
changes. And if not, and this is something that I'm also working on is, well, what if we could just do a step test every single day and get your zoning based on that? And you don't have to go to max or something like that. It's just something I'm throwing out there, but it's something I'm working on is like, well, what if we could do that? And then you would know, okay, zone 2 is probably about here. Zone 4 is about here. So if I'm doing, high intensity stuff, I got to be up here and
Yeah.
then look at my responses. Zone 2 got to be close. And I think too, like we can't throw everything out with the bathwater, right? You can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, saying like, uh, it, even if you found your max heart rate and then use those, that's still going to get you pretty close, or relatively close, close
Yeah.
enough, right? So,
Yeah,
so yeah,
absolutely.
it's
And that's why this fluctuation and variation, that's why I still think the three zone model isn't that bad,
mm-mm,
because it combines all the, reliability issues and day by day variation and so on. And um, I think it's okay. I know it's not perfect, but I think it's okay. And for the purpose of that, this review article, I think it was good because we could a little bit compare the studies having three zones and five zones, so we could a little bit squeeze them together and have more data. But
mm-hmm,
I'm aware that depending on the sports, you really you do other types of testing. But as you said, in the end, you're trying to define a physiological benchmark or some reference point which allows you to distinguish zone 1, 2, and 3. And I actually I would say maybe it's not that important which boundary you use. It's more the amount of data you're gathering a little bit.
mm-hmm,
Then there are other concepts like critical power or and also other terminology from Stöger and I we define zone 1, 2, and 3 in the 2014 publication because in Germany we call zone 1 is basic endurance exercise. Some call it moderate, some call it easy exercise, and I didn't want to go down that route. What is basic and what is not so basic? And
mm-hmm.
I said to Tom, let's just call it zone 1, 2, and 3, and we're out of all the issues around that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I
The
totally,
subjective nature of saying, oh, easy versus moderate
absolutely, yeah,
versus,
and yeah. So that was a little bit why we called it zone 1, 2, and 3, and that was I think the easiest to do at the time.
mm-hmm,
And from there on, the minute you have this zone 1, 2, and 3, what then happened, or actually there was data in the 80s and 90s already on how much time do athletes or really high end elite athletes spend in each zone 1, 2, and 3.
mm-hmm,
And actually, I would say the most prominent distribution is what Tom and I defined as pyramidal training intensity distribution,
mm-hmm,
which means that zone 1 is maybe 70%, maybe even 80% of the entire time invested related to zone 1. Zone 2, a little bit less, could be maybe 10 or 15%, and zone 3, even more, even lesser. So that's the typical, we didn't have a better term, so we called it pyramidal.
mm-hmm.
And it's been stuck in the literature. So yeah, so that's
I mean,
that's
it
okay.
makes sense, right? If you had a pyramid, right,
Yeah,
it would go zone 1, zone 2, zone 3. So
the that's it. Yeah,
makes sense. I think it's really easy to explain to people visually on Instagram with that, right? Because you just put it as a
it is.
pyramid,
Yeah.
and
And
then
I have to say that's actually, if I look into the literature, 70, 80% of all the training intensity distributions we identified actually were pyramidal,
mm-hmm,
but with a very, very large variation in the amount of zone 1, 2, and 3. But nevertheless, most or I would say almost all of the literature was between 60 and 90% of the entire time spent in zone 1. So a
mm-hmm,
huge amount in zone 1, and that seems to be I would say it's not the unique, but it's not new information. But that's what endurance athletes do. They invest a lot of time in zone one, and then in
Yeah, and
2000, yeah,
I was going to say, and the reason why we can invest so much time in zone one, or we should be investing so much time in zone one, is because it gives us the ability to build volume. And we know that volume is important for things like capillary density, mitochondrial density. And of course, with high intensity interval training, you still get some of that response. But it's a way of accumulating a lot of volume without accumulating tons of fatigue. So it keeps you consistent over time. And I think that's what people kind of miss out is like, they're like, oh, well, if I'm not exactly at 1.8 millimolar lactate, then I'm not getting all the benefits
yeah,
of
yeah.
zone 2 training or whatever. It's like, no. That's, you're missing the point of what zone 2, or in this case, zone 1 training actually is. It's to accumulate a lot of volume, be able to recover from day to day to day, so that when you then go to do your threshold training or your high intensity interval training, you actually are capable of doing that better each time you come back and do it.
Absolutely, but keep in mind we don't know how long that session should be.
Right.
There is no model. I couldn't even tell you if a runner comes up to me, a really good runner, and he'd say, okay, I'm up for a long jog, a long run. How long should that be? And the
Mm-hmm.
only thing I can do is to look at his training history or
Yep.
her, just see what's been going on and decide from there on. But there's no really good fancy, nothing, shaky appearing. Of course,
Right.
you get tired, you get hungry after a while. So maybe hunger could be something like I don't know, maybe a benchmark. It could
Mm-hmm.
be, I don't know, feeling cold or cool, or I don't know. So
Yeah. Or
that's an
like,
issue in actual.
yeah, I was gonna say, or changes to, heart rate response. Right. A lot of
Yeah, some
people, or
drifts. Yeah, some cardiac
mm-hmm.
drifts. That seems to be this terminology of durability
Yep.
is now popping up. So some maybe some drifts that could be something. But in our publication, we didn't look at that at all
Mm-hmm.
because many of those publications do not give us the true volumes per session. So
Mm.
I couldn't even tell you on how long a typical zone one exercise would be.
Well, and then it's going to depend on if the person's been hydrating the entire time, if they're in a hot or a cold room, if they're, eating food,
Carbs, high
carbohydrates. Yeah.
altitude, whatsoever.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
so too many variables that go into it. And I think exactly like what you said, the practical outcome of that is, okay, well, it has to be based on the athlete's, previous history. And we will then progressively overload them in all aspects, right? Even the low intensity volume. So you slowly building that up over time. And it's, yeah, that's such a interesting point, is that we're really good at defining intensities, but we're not good at defining, say, like the amount of volume that those intensities should
No,
be
the
done
only
at, really.
the only thing you can do is you look at training history, you break that down and say, okay, an average long training session lasts, I don't know, in cycling 5 hours, 6 hours, and then you try to hit that and maybe add another 2, 3, 5% on top of that, and that's what you
Hmm.
call progression. That's the only
Right.
thing we have.
Right. So it's pretty arbitrary when we say it like that, right? Which it is. It's just like, yeah.
There's nothing. I couldn't tell you anything. Any other model. So then the interesting part then was in 2000, I believe it was in 2006. Stephen Sally he looked at junior cross country skiers,
Hmm.
really top notch in Norway, and he used the three zone model, and he identified that it seems those cross country skiers they do a little or they have a little different pattern, which then was called polarized, meaning you have a lot of time invested in zone one
Mm-hmm.
not so much in zone 2 and more in zone 3. And that's why those two polar zone 1 and 3 are higher than zone 2. But I looked at that publication again, and the interesting part was the observation period was only 1 month. So
Hmm.
they looked at a 1 month period. I think 300 and something training sessions overall. And in 2000, I don't remember, 20 or 21, I had a training experiment together with Gunnar Treff. He was responsible for also some scientific background in the rowing federation, and we were thinking of doing a study. Okay, what are the physiological differences between pyramidal and a polarized training protocol?
Mm-hmm.
And he organized and invested basically all of his time in that study. And the interesting part was actually we made it happen. We had two groups, really, I would say, quite highly trained rowers, engaging in pyramidal and in polarized. And the interesting part was the study ended more or less with the first qualification championships, so or
Mm-hmm.
the first qualification competitions. And the interesting part is, of course, you can tell the coach, okay, try to engage in a pyramidal type of training intensity distribution, which within the first 5 weeks, maybe, or 6 weeks in the 10 or 12 week intervention we had, actually went perfectly, was
Mm-hmm.
really good. But going towards the first qualification competition, the coach automatically engaged in more zone 2 and zone 3 exercise. And in the end, the pyramidal group actually was a polarized group,
Mm.
just because of tapering and aligning the intensity to the competition.
Mm-hmm.
What I want to say is that in that Norwegian analysis, it is important to know when the data was gathered. And if you look at an entire season, and if you look at what athletes do, a seasonal analysis, I think, is not a very good proximity on the amount of intensity, because it's more interesting on when and how do athletes change maybe their training intensity distribution. And that's actually
Mm-hmm.
what we see. If you look at preparation periods in each sport, then we have a lot more pyramidal training intensity distributions throughout the sports. And when entering the competition phase, you have more zone 2 and zone 3. And I would say, depending on the federation and the sports, you'll even have more zone 3. Or if you are in those, let's say, long distance sports, like, let's say, running, you'll probably do more zone 2 exercise, because zone
Mm-hmm.
2 exercise is very, very close to your competition or to your race pace, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a little bit of an issue. And I would say the first observation from Norway was interesting, because it showed us maybe on how to maybe to quantify intensity. But the thing what happened was, okay, these guys are high-end Norwegian cross-country skiers, polarized equals success. That's what I do. And I think that's
Mm-hmm.
a little bit what happened.
Mm-hmm.
But uh, we, we were one of the first ones to do a prospective or a training experiment, and the polarized seemed favorable there. But I have a hypothesis maybe on that as well. So
Yeah,
um,
I saw that paper as well that said something along the line, like the title was something along the lines of polarized training is, you know, better at improving performance
Exactly.
variables compared to pyramidal training. And what you've been essentially talking about this entire time that we've been talking about, pyramidal or polarized training is this idea that training should go from general in the preparatory phase towards more specific as you get closer to your competition.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what we really need to highlight. And it really is interesting how people take, like a research article or whatever it is, and you highlight it as like, the Seiler paper was 4-week training intervention, and I don't know when in the season it was, but it could have been, in the base training season, it could have been competition, but whatever they were training for at the time necessitated them to have a polarized training model, because that's the type of adaptation the coach was looking for, right? Whereas then when you take a step back and then start to look at the paper that you did, it's, well, yes, a lot of the time in the preparatory phase it is pyramidal, or it is polarized, excuse me, but then it shifts depending on where you're at in the season and what sort of physiological outcomes you're trying to really program into those
Yeah,
athletes.
absolutely. A beautiful explanation, and that's personally why I'm a little bit in that on that avenue, saying a best practice training intensity distribution does not exist, because
Mm-hmm.
the day by day variation you have, the daily decision making you have, changing your intensity because of weather, because of mood, because of eating, whatsoever, you really don't know, might lead to a certain training intensity distribution, but trying to replicate that in the next season most probably will not work, because these
Right.
daily fluctuations you have, it's nearly impossible. So, and that's another thing. A pre-planned schedule versus an actually executed plan. That's actually a quite interesting research topic on what was the plan and what did I do, and
Mm-hmm.
why is there a difference? And unfortunately, we do not get that information from all of those papers. I'd be interested in, was the training intensity distribution reported in those publications, was that a plan, meaning a was it intended to be that way, or was
Mm-hmm.
it just a result on how the season, on how the life or lifestyle of this athlete occurred? And that's a little bit the issue I have with the retrospective analysis in those sports. But there's
Mm-hmm.
another very important issue, is on how to quantify not only the models, the zoning, but how do you
Mm-hmm.
quantify? Is it the time in a zone? Do you use heart rate? Do you is it based on race pace and so on? And those quantification methods are really, really different. Meaning, I think I cannot compare, or we shouldn't compare quantification methods or only studies with the same quantification methods. Otherwise,
Mm-hmm.
we're measuring like it be you have one study done on heart rate and the other one on VO2 max, and you try to find out which one's better. I think that's not the way to do.
No, I agree with that, and I think what I try to tell people, because I'm always trying to say, okay, what is the research saying versus like how can we translate this into our everyday life? And what I try to tell people is that pick something and repeat it over time. So if you want to use, heart rate, then use heart rate zones going forward. If you want to use power zones going forward, and then
Absolutely.
quantify it from there. Because that's gonna, like you've probably taught like a methods class like in academia, where it's like, you have the bullseye. And what we're really aiming for is we're aiming for a tight cluster at the bullseye. That's ideal. But then, you could also have something that's a tight cluster, but it's shifted over a little bit. And, it's like, okay, well, if we can't get that, if we can't get the optimal one, the accuracy and the precision, at least we can get the precision. and maybe I'm messing up the definition, but we get that tight clustering because we're doing the same measurements time and time and time again. And if we do look at the paper that you guys published, it is interesting because when you look at time spent in a heart rate zone or time spent in a power zone, those do greatly change the training intensity distributions to the point where it's like, one of them goes from maybe a polarized model with 90 and 10% to a pyramidal model with like a little bit more distribution. I don't know if it was uh, you know, that extreme in terms of the differences, but it definitely changed the way you could potentially interpret the data.
Absolutely, definitely. Yeah, keep that in mind. Another quite interesting information in that publication also was altogether we were able to identify 175 training intensity distributions from all different type of endurance sports: running, biathlon, cross country skiing, cycling, swimming, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, the interesting part was actually I just had to look up the real number of the 175 training intensity distributions. 49%, so half of those were from single case studies.
Mm-hmm.
So, and a single case study has huge advantages because you can control, you have an idea, you know the person, and so on. But of course, that's just one solution of one elite athlete, and
Yeah.
surely is not a template for everybody else. And the interesting part of those 49, 67, so 2/3 of those single case studies were from cross country skiing. So I think there is in that story, there's I don't want to say a bias, but yeah, maybe not. Why not? Towards cross country skiing,
Mm-hmm.
which not necessarily means it's true for running, it's true for others. So the issue single case plus many, many single cases in cross country skiing does not add up to the, let's say, the family of endurance sports.
Mm-hmm.
And keeping that in mind, cross country skiing is a complete different sport when compared to running and to cycling,
Mm-hmm.
especially
And then
also in Norway. I even would say the culture in Norway is a different one. If I compare it, for example, here to Germany, I would say Norway in itself is a more endurance type country. I don't want to say Germany isn't, but it's a different spirit.
mm-hmm.
And that might influence intensities and pushing each other and so on. So this maybe the mentality also plays a role in that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I have never been over to Kenya to meet, like the really great Kenyan runners or anything like that, but I've had friends who have done so. And Kenya is a country all about running, right? That's a way of like
It's a
that's like,
lifestyle, yeah.
yeah, it's a lifestyle. And it totally is different, say in the United States, where it's football, baseball, basketball, maybe hockey, but it's mostly team sports. And so yeah, just that mentality, right? It's like, in Kenya, they're like, I've heard of kids who are going to and from school, and it's 10 kilometers each way. So they're walking slash running to and from school every single day since they're,
Absolutely.
5 years
Yeah.
old. I didn't run my first like anything until, I got into like maybe fifth grade, or, I don't even know what the age of that would, maybe 10 years old, something along those lines. So, if you start to think about that, it's like, well, these kids, since they were like, maybe 5, 6 years old, are already walking slash, doing tons and tons of low level sedentary activity. And then on top of it, it's a way of like that's like, if you're a professional runner, that's like the big shot over there. Whereas
Yeah,
here, it's like football,
absolutely.
basketball, those sort of things. So yes, I absolutely believe that culture and the mentality behind things, uh, you know, begets better and better athletes within whatever sport it is. And that's why, people in Kenya or from Kenya, people from Ethiopia have been so dominant at like the longer distance and even the shorter distance running and track events for so long, because that's just it's within their culture. That's like what they take pride in. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and you can't quantify that though, right? It's like, oh well, how much do you care about your sport compared to
No, but
somebody
Kenya,
else?
I think, is a good example. The data I have from Kenyan runners is, and Andrew Jones has published, and they actually published a quite controversial debate and rebuttal article in Medicine, Science, Sports, and Exercise on intensity, polarized, non-polarized, and so on.
Hmm.
And runners actually, I would say the high-end runners are not targeting zone 3 if we're in this zone 3 model again. They wouldn't go for the zone 3 or for the high-end zone 3 areas. So they will target rather zone 2 or maybe zone 2 plus
Yeah.
as a high intensity. But for them, that's already a very, very high intensity. So for runners, actually, zone 2 is an important intensity zone, because what it does is it stimulates a little bit, or helps your pacing.
Mm-hmm.
If you exercise in that area that's close or just maybe beneath your race pace, and this pacing, knowing, can I just do another 5% more or 3% more. That's psychology involved in that is quite important. Now, if you're a
Mm-hmm.
mountain biker just going uphill, and you just have a single trail, and the first one on the single trail is more or less the winner, you'll be in zone 4 in a zone 3 model. You'll be above. You'll really be hitting it hard. So those sports are different. They are
Mm-hmm.
different, and I think we should this term endurance. We have so much data on endurance sports. I think we should name the sports we're analyzing. It shouldn't be a new training method in endurance sport. It should be a training method in the sports you're doing,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
especially
then
on
and
the
then
elite
from
level.
that you have to break it down, right? Is it mountain biking or is it road biking? Road
Absolutely.
cycling, right? Because those are totally different sports. And I've been talking to people like, oh, I'm training for mountain biking or cross country riding, and my like they sent me their power profile, and it was like bouncing up and down the entire time from
Uh,
like 600 watts to 100 watts, and it was like just going the entire. I was like, oh my gosh, like I would die, first of all, like if I had to try to emulate that. But it just, because then when you're on the road, you can have a pretty steady power profile, right? Because it's not this up and down bursts of energy, bursts of speed. It's the same thing with ultra running versus road marathoning. Totally different, and the requirements for that, right, are very, very different. And I like that take. And I think what we all have to remind ourselves of is that, the single best way to, get better at a sport is to identify the challenges within that sport, and then train to get specifically better at those. And having a coach allows you to then take both a subjective and objective look at the data that you're getting, and not be blinded by, say, your ego. Because I know for sure I've
or
tried to train
belief, or
myself,
belief. Yeah,
or belief, or yeah, because I've trained myself a lot and I've wound up injured a lot because I always believe that I can do more, than really what my physiology or what my, true capabilities are. So yeah,
absolutely.
that's super interesting. So with the little bit of time we have left, I would like to touch on the differences that you guys found within the repeat VO2 max um, re, study, but we don't have to do that right now. That's another really interesting study that I'm going to read, and I'm going to publish on my Instagram. So we might need to bring you back to talk about that, because that is also crazy. But in from your opinion, you're right, you've used, or you talked about, using wearables in terms of
Yeah.
training and other things like that. For individuals, first of all, how would you recommend going about using wearables to inform your training? And then do you have any ones that you're like, well, these ones are pretty good, these ones are pretty noisy, but if you have, like the correct expertise, it's good to use, like, how do they kind of like stack up for you?
Yeah. Actually, that's a question I get quite often, quite often.
Hmm.
Maybe to start off, if you engage in a certain type of exercise, I think you should think of what is your driving framework, what is your driving model. It could be heart rate based, meaning I have a certain watt or a certain pace, and I just want to see what my heart rate says at a certain pace. And over time, what should happen at the same power output, your heart rate should go down just because you become more economic. So,
Hmm.
this is what we've been calling internal versus external, let's say, comparison over time. So, that's a
Hmm.
certain type of model. Um, if that's your driving idea behind training adaptation and changes over time, then of course you can decide which type of wearables might be interesting in providing me an information which is helpful for that framework.
Hmm.
And if that's the case, internal versus external, I could think probably of 5 or 10 different internal variables I could measure. I could use blood lactate, heart rate, oxygen uptake, NIRS, as you said. It could be subjective data, blood glucose, whatsoever. So your training model, the model you're looking for, I think that's the first question you need to solve. If you're if you're aware of that model, then currently I would say there's a lot of technology out. Unfortunately, usually not everything in a smartwatch. Some you might need 2 or 3 devices in order to
Hmm.
collect the information you need. So I'm totally okay if somebody says I'm monitoring or I'm navigating through my training using just heart rate or using near infrared or I'm totally fine with that. The thing the coach or the athletes or ideally both need to define is what is a successful and what is a non-successful framework, and I think that's the thing really a good coach needs to be aware of. Saying, okay, with this athlete, my usual model I've been applying isn't really good, isn't a helpful model. So let's change the way of thinking. And maybe by doing so, let's change the information I need. Meaning it
Hmm.
could be the usual devices you've been using might not necessarily be the same ones in a different athlete. And that's a little
Hmm.
bit a tricky thing. For me, I've been creating this 24-hour, or I'm trying to stimulate this 24-hour thinking because 24 hours is actually a quite interesting thinking. If you look at elite athletes overall, let's say triathletes, cyclists, cross country skiers, they invest in 1,000 hours per year and even more. Adding up on average, that's a daily load of about 4 hours. That's the time those athletes invest, having some time off, some maybe injuries or illness and so on. So, but on average 4 hours, meaning in a 24-hour period, you only invest 4 hours into training, and the other 20 hours you can behave, let's say, quite stupidly, but you also can behave, I would say, strategically correct,
Hmm.
meaning you look at sleep, nutrition, free time activity, with whom you interact, and so on. And that actually was my starting point of the wearable technology. What I wanted to know is how much time, maybe sleep, still sleep with accelerometers is a little bit like, measuring room temperature with your body scale. It's not the right device, for
Right.
sleep quality. But still, there's some technology coming out, maybe based more on heart rate variability, and some other technologies coming out. They're surely not perfect, but still they provide a certain type of information.
Hmm.
But we need to be aware, what is the information and how reliable is the information. And that was a little bit my start off. And interestingly, athletes have adapted this nerdy, which device is best. For ages. We've had perfect devices. We never called them wearables, but we had a good chest belt, for
Hmm.
heart rate monitoring. Why change that? It just doesn't make to just use it. And we've also had other good devices, where we could check the model and then identify, is the model good or bad? Does it work or not? Is it successful, not successful? And I've been interested in, can I identify technology giving me some information on, I call them the modulators, modulating physiology, because in all of the studies so far, we always have responders or potential responders and non-responders.
Hmm.
But I would say within a typical 20 or 30 person training experiment, there's so many differences in sleep time, in free time activity, free time, actually exercise intensity,
Hmm.
in how people engage, in which circumstances they are. And we know psychology modulates your biochemistry,
Hmm.
sleep modulates your biochemistry. So why not harvest that information, and just have a little bit more information on properly interpreting a training experiment?
I,
If you
I,
want, now that was the long story. The short
yeah.
story is, what I would recommend a coach is identifying the model.
Hmm.
The next step is identifying the key elements you would need to change within that model. It could be economy, it could be, I don't know, some concentric forces, whatsoever. You identify some gaps within your athlete, and try to solve those, maybe two to three key elements.
Hmm.
Uh, Reevaluate and go from there on. So those key
Hmm.
elements for me are, I think, the aspects to go. And you can use models more related to biochemistry, more to biomechanics, more to psychology, more to neuromuscular modeling, whatsoever. I think there are many, many avenues, but the important part is knowing when is a model successful or not, and
Hmm.
identifying the key components necessary. And I think from there on, you'll find the technology.
Right.
It's I don't want to say it's out, because not all devices are reliable,
Hmm.
but still the technology is out. You just need to use it.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's great. And I think too, you touched on that most recently, or the paper published in 2022 about we need to look at changes to whatever outcome variables that we're measuring, and we need to know what the biological and the measurement variability is.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So you have to make sure that what you're increasing, say your thing is VO2 max. Say you've identified this athlete's VO2 max is too low. You need to know, when you go and do this VO2 max test again, is it outside of that biological and that measurement error? Because if it's within it, then then
It's
statistically
nothing.
speaking, yeah, exactly. It's a non-significant increase in VO2 max. So then you need to switch something up. But if it's outside of that, then that's a really good indication that you've successfully you've had a success in that. So yeah, this has been a really awesome talk, Dr. Sperlich. I really appreciate you coming on, and I won't take any more of your time, but where can people find you on places like social media and stuff like that?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram and on Twitter. So if you look up Billy Sperlich, you'll find me on Instagram and on Twitter. And in 2010 now, actually, yeah, 13 years ago, I launched a blog called www.sportsandscience.de. You'll find some information. It's a little bit split in German and English, depending on the content. There's some podcast episodes as well. I'm starting with podcast as well, or I've been in that area, but I'm not a frequent podcaster in that sense. But every time I have something interesting, I use it. So yeah, browse along and yeah, maybe you'll like the content.
Yeah, and I'm gonna dig into that other paper we talked about with the repeatability of stuff and share it on my social media. Definitely.
That was a
I will
fun one. Yeah.
tag. Yeah, no, I have always wanted to do a study like that, so I'm glad somebody else did. And I've been fortunate enough to essentially have mobile metabolic devices and stuff, so
Cool.
I can repeat those
Good.
tests over time. So I'm
Good.
doing one a month now. But yeah, I will put all of Dr. Sperlich's information in the show notes below. As always, you guys can find me at Critical02 on Instagram. If you're on YouTube, comment down below with any questions about training intensity distributions, wearables, anything like that we talked about in the show. And we'll catch you guys in the next one.